Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining me. This is FCC Standby Posturing. My name is Scott Deerbacker. I am currently the FCC process engineer at Chevron's Pasadena refinery. I have a little over 5 years in the refining industry as a process engineer, and about half that time has been spent on FCCs. Today, I was planning on going over 3 standby postures that we use within the Chevron system, and also cover some of the procedure elements that we use to make sure that we're in a safe standby posture. All right, well, I guess before we get started, I also want to cover a disclaimer. The presentation and slide deck contain information that might not necessarily be applicable to your specific unit. We use them internally as guidelines in order to ensure that we got a safe standby posture, but it's not necessarily intended to be taken as explicit instructions. So that's just something to keep in mind as we move through the slideshow. So let's introduce our standby postures. So the first standby posture we have is our slump posture. There is really not a whole lot special about this slump posture. The only real element we have is steam going to our reactor. We do not have any air going to our regenerator, and of course that means we don't have torch hole or the direct fired air heater online. We do not have our ESP energized, we do not have our frac blinded, and of course no catalyst circulation and no feed into the riser. Our second standby posture is a fluidized posture. It's going to be very similar to that slump posture, except now we got the main air blower online and we are sending air to the regenerator. So we have both vessels fluidized in this posture. Additionally, depending on where you are in your startup procedure, you may or may not have torch oil or your direct fired air heater online. So that's why this is listed as a maybe. The third standby posture is the dry circulation posture. So we have both of the vessels still fluidized, air to the regenerator, steam to the reactor. We have torch oil and the direct fired air heater online right now. And now we got the slide valves open and we are starting to circulate catalyst in preparation for feed in. So one critical theme that all of these standby postures share is that you do not want to send air to a hydrocarbon atmosphere and you do not want to send hydrocarbon to an air atmosphere. That is very bad. And so we primarily safeguard against this by maintaining the reactor as the high pressure point in the system. And so when you hear me refer to the pressure balance and making sure that pressure balance is maintained, that is what I'm referring to, is keeping that reactor at a higher pressure than your hydrocarbon side on your fractionator and your air side on your regenerator. Finally, these are high-risk postures. Proper precautions must be taken to make sure that you maintain a safe posture. Detonations of ESPs have occurred in this mode of operation, and you are at higher risk of ESP detonation in this mode of operation compared to normal operation. So, moving on, the theme I want to talk about next is the ability of the catalyst to seal. And as the title kind of hints at, the catalyst does not seal by itself. The catalyst sitting in the standpipe isn't preventing the gases from going from a high pressure vessel to a low pressure vessel, especially since those slide valves are not positive closure devices. You will have gas leaking by those slide valves, and if the catalyst is below its minimum fluidization velocity, it's just going to pass right through your catalyst as well. So the only way that you're able to maintain that seal is if you have something fluidizing that catalyst, and then the catalyst actually holds head pressure on that slide valve. So that's the only way that you're going to be able to move from a low pressure vessel into a high pressure vessel. One other thing I did want to note before we move on is that the catalyst isn't doing, or I guess rather, the catalyst is still doing something sitting on top of that slide valve. It's kind of acting as a restriction to limit the rate of gas that we have going through there. So this is going to be critical, especially if your slide valve is eroded and you got gas that would be whizzing through if you didn't have any callus there, but that callus can act as a restriction to limit the amount of gas through. So there is some value in it, but again, if you're going from the gas will always go from a high pressure vessel to a low pressure vessel. With that being said, let's jump into some of the procedure elements. So this is a visual depiction of our standby 1 slumped posture. Like I mentioned, we got steam going in the reactor. That involves lift steam at the bottom of the riser. That also involves dispersion steam going to our feed nozzles. The main air blower is offline. The callus in the regenerator is not fluidized, and the slide valves are both closed, so we are not moving catalyst between vessels. First things first, you are going to want to ensure that all ignition sources are shut down, bypassed, or isolated. If you do get into a situation where you form a combustible atmosphere, you do not want anything around to ignite it. So that might include your ESP, your direct fired air heater, or your CO boiler. Keeping with our critical theme of keeping hydrocarbon out of air environments, you're going to want to verify that all hydrocarbon sources to the reactor and regenerator are closed, including torch oil, your fuel gas purges, and you're going to want to, in this posture, make sure that you do not have any air being injected. And we isolate or double block and bleed as a stabilizing action. Similarly, all feeds to the riser reactor must be blocked in, and this includes your fresh feed or any slurry you're recycling, and potentially any quench oil you got going in, and also double block and bleed as a stabilizing action. This would be a good time to point out that just because your SIS system tripped doesn't mean that feed is diverted from your riser. We always have a step in our procedure to put manual blocks in order to validate that we do not have oil leaking by those valves going into the riser. I'm sure all of us are aware of situations where valves don't hold and leak, and that could be a critical situation. So make sure you get those manual blocks in those valves. We're going to want to confirm that the slide valves are closed and that the callus is not leaking by those valves. That in this posture is primarily accomplished by having an accurate reactor level indication. Making sure that you have a reliable level, you got good purges on your taps is going to be critical to making sure that your slide valve is not leaking by. If you lose oil flow going through your furnace, you're going to want to make sure that the fuel gas chopped. You do not want to have a heater firing while you got stagnant oil in those furnace tubes. So that is going to be a critical element. You are going to want steam going to the air blower discharge, your riser, your feed nozzles, and your torch oil nozzles. The feed nozzles and the steam going to the feed nozzles and the steam going to the riser is primarily there to make sure that you can maintain that good pressure profile like we talked about with the reactor as the high pressure point in the system. And you're going to want that reactor pressure. We shoot for greater than 2 pounds. I know in some FCCs that might be a little bit difficult with how they're designed, but we do target greater than 2 pounds for the reactor as the peak in that pressure profile. The steam going to the main air blower discharge is being injected to help keep that catalyst out of that, or help keep catalyst from migrating back into your blower. This can be problematic because oil soaked on catalyst in your regenerator at temperatures greater than 1,000 degrees can form hydrogen and carbon monoxide when exposed to steam via the water gas shift reaction. So because of this, long-term steaming is not recommended. You do not want to form a combustible atmosphere inside your regenerator. The steam going to the feed nozzles and torch oil nozzles also tries to keep catalyst from backflowing into them. And I did want to mention that the steam to the feed nozzle should be a design curve specification based on what your feed nozzle vendor has spec'd out. So make sure that your procedure is bringing the steam to the prescribed rate when you introduce steam going to those feed nozzles. You want to verify that the main air blower discharge line is clear and that the check valve has closed. This can be accomplished either through the viewport on the direct fired air heater, or alternatively, if you have bleeders along the line, you can use a bleeder to see if you do have callus backflowing into that main air blower discharge line. You're going to want to check the status of the wet gas compressor. In some use, the wet gas compressor will auto trip on the blower shutdown. So that is primarily there in order to keep our pressure profile good. Again, I'm going to hammer it home, keeping that reactor as the high pressure point in the system. And keeping a reliable main fractionator pressure will help make sure that we can keep the reactor as that high pressure point. If your unit does have a power recovery turbine, make sure that the flue gas quench system is functioning properly. We do not want to exceed the inlet temperature limits for that expander. Now that we've done all that, we can start to transition to standby 2, get that main air blower online. And so that's what these 2 steps involve. So first, we're going to purge out our flue gas system. We recommend using nitrogen or steam, and we target quantities of 3 volume changes from the purge point to the stack. And you're going to want to verify via the fuel gas sample port that the sample gas in the regenerator is not does not have any combustibles. Additionally, you do not want water in your regenerator. Water and callus do not play nice, so make sure that the steam is dry, preferably superheated. After you've done all your purging and you verified that there's no combustibles in the system, we can start to turn on our main air blower and cut it over to the regenerator. Be careful to do this slowly. Temperature spikes may occur, and if they do occur, you're going to want to back out the main air blower pretty quickly. If those are encountered, you're going to want to go back to your purging steps, repurge out the system, do another combustibles check before you start to bring the main air blower back online into the regenerator. All right, that we can move on to the fluidized posture. Similar to the last posture, we got lift steam going in the bottom of the riser. We got dispersion steam going to our feed nozzles. We have the main air blower online now, like we did in with the last few steps of the previous posture, and we still have the slide valves closed. And before we leave this slide, I would like to note that we are maintaining a good pressure profile. We got that reactor as the high pressure point in the system, lower pressure on the regenerator and the main fractionator. So first thing we want to do in this is confirm that the feed has been bypassed with the isolation valves closed, like we talked about previously. Double block and bleed as a stabilizing action. We're going to remove our ignition sources, de-energize the ESP. We do not want the ESP energized until we can verify that there is no combustibles in the system after we get stable. We're going to keep our good pressure profile by having nitrogen or steam routed to the riser to keep that riser or keep the reactor as the high pressure point. I would like to note that we do use pressure as opposed to flow rate because pressure is going to be applicable to any FCC. Your steam flow rates might have varying pressure implications depending on what your mix line was sized for. So pressures will always be valid under any unit operating conditions, not necessarily those flow rates. Like we talked about, we want the steam going to the feed nozzles at the design curve specifications. We do not want any callus getting back into those feed nozzles and potentially plugging them up. And after that, we are going to monitor those vessel velocities to prevent exceeding velocity and temperature limits within the system. The velocity limits that we're primarily going to be looking at is going to be our air grid, our region superficial velocity, our cyclone inlet velocities, just making sure that we're within our design limits to not have any excessive callus losses or excessive erosion if we get too high. And also the temperature limits. An interesting point on this is that with the direct fired air heater online in this posture, the air has potential to exceed the design temperature of the air grids. A lot of times the air grids aren't designed for continuous operation with the direct fired air heater online. So just be aware of what your limits are for that system and be cognizant of how much time you're spending above the design temperature limit of that air grid. Similar to the previous posture, we're going to be confirming that the slide valves are closed and that we're maintaining levels, this time in both the reactor and the regenerator. So again, that comes back to having accurate level indication. So making sure we have good purges and that we can validate those levels is going to be important. Ideally, we'd like to have our main fractionator on nitrogen pressure control, and that's just to stabilize that pressure profile that we were talking about. Steam is also acceptable, and as a last resort, fuel gas can be used, but we really like using nitrogen if possible. Use the torch oil or the direct fired air here to control the regenerator temperature up to what your procedures call for. Keep the main fractionator and the gas plant stable and maintain the levels in those vessels. Conduct extensive catalyst loss monitoring. This will involve primarily checking your ESP bins, gauging your bins, making sure you're not accumulating too many fines, validating that your opacity is within your environmental limits. While not a huge risk in this posture, it becomes a much bigger risk in later postures, and that is carrying callus over to your fractionator. So in the dry circulation posture, we actually will start to be monitoring the solids content of the bottom system. And a great way to validate that you do have steam going from your reactor to your main fractionator is by watching that overhead accumulator water level build, or have your control valve open. If your control valve is not open, taking water out of your accumulator, that steam is going somewhere else besides the fractionator. So that is definitely something, a good mental check to do to validate that the system is operating as we intend it to do. Very cool. After we've done all that, we're ready for dry circulation. So with that, we got lift steam going in the bottom of the riser. We got dispersion steam going to our feed nozzles. We still got the main air blower online, fluidizing catalyst in both of these vessels. And now we have opened our slide valves and we're moving catalyst between these vessels. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to confirm that the feed has been bypassed and have those isolation valves closed, double block and bleed as a stabilizing action. That is going to be similar to where we were at in the last posture. We're going to maintain that pressure profile with nitrogen or steam at adequate rates to keep that reactor as the high pressure point. We have to have adequate steam to the feed nozzles like we talked about based on the design curve to prevent callus from backflowing into them. And we are going to keep a careful eye on the velocity and temperature limits of the system. Something new for Standby 3 is that we're going to need to have oil flow established through the fractionator bottom system. This covers two things. The first is going to be you need to have your slurry reflux established in order to wash all the callus coming over from the reactor. Additionally, you're going to want an adequate flush to tankage to prevent from building up catalyst in that bottom system. Adjust the callus circulation rates as necessary to keep your temperature rise in your reactor manageable. Start pretty modest and then use that callus circulation to control the temperature rise in that reactor. We do not want to be exceeding our temperature gradient limits because we can run into refractory issues in that case. Keep a good eye on the reactor regenerator pressure balance. So not only do we want to make sure that the reactor is the high point in the system, but it is much easier to circulate callus when you have stable pressures throughout the system and stable slide valve DPs. So that ties directly into the next point of make sure your main fractionator is on pressure control. That main fractionator holds back pressure on that reactor, as I'm sure we all know. So we want to make sure that that pressure stays stable, so our reactor pressure stays stable, so we can circulate catalyst really well. Once we get up on temperatures, we can start to use torch oil to control the regenerator temperature. So that's as we prepare for feed in, keep on heating up and monitor those heat up rates to make sure that we're not going too quickly. We're going to keep an eye on that flue gas system to make sure that we're not forming a combustible atmosphere. And we're going to keep that ESP de-energized until we can validate that we are not forming a combustible atmosphere in a stable posture. We're still going to keep a stable main fractionator and gas plant, making sure those levels are maintained. And this is going to be one of the most critical elements for dry circulation. As we move catalyst from the regenerator up the riser through the reactor, that gas that's entrained with that catalyst will have oxygen in it. So you will have oxygen build up in that main fractionator overhead receiver. So monitoring for excessive oxygen buildup and steam condensate acidity is going to be critical while we're dry circulating. And finally, you're going to want to make sure that you know where your catalyst is going. Monitor the slurry ash content to see how much of that catalyst is being carried out through your reactor disengager and cyclones, and make sure that you have that purge as necessary to keep the catalyst in the bottom system within manageable limits. Additionally, like we talked about previously, you're going to want to also keep checking your ESP bins and make sure that your opacity is manageable while you're maintaining this posture. Cool, so that covers most of the procedure elements that we use for each of these standby postures. The last thing I wanted to talk about is typical posturing considerations. So for standby 1, this slump posture, we typically do not want to be in the slump posture if it's not absolutely necessary. Generally, our hand is forced, but it's in situations where we cannot control catalyst circulation. So that's slide valve failures, loss of the fluidization media, something that requires us to jump into this posture. Additionally, you might be forced to go into this posture if you cannot maintain a good pressure profile. Again, keeping that reactor above the regenerator and the fractionator pressures. Fluidized is a good posture. It's typical for most oil out trips that don't involve the main air blower or wet gas compressor, but really where we'd like to be is standby 3, our dry circulation. In this posture, we feel like the unit is the safest and most stable. The unit is designed to be hot, and this replicates where the unit is designed to be as best as possible. So we like to be in standby 3 if at all possible. Again, kind of like we talked about previously, I'm going to go through some of the considerations to have in this posture. Extended periods of time of dry circulation, especially with the high temperatures and the presence of steam, can really deactivate the catalyst. So you can see significant catalyst activity loss if you are circulating for long periods of time. Additionally, having that oxygen buildup in that main fractionator is going to be unacceptable. That's going to be unsafe. So we're going to want to maintain a purge to keep the oxygen from forming a combustible atmosphere in that receiver. And you're going to want to sample that system as well to make sure that the oxygen content isn't getting to the point where you could get below that upper flammability limit. And that covers standby postures. Thank you guys all for joining me. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A, and I hope we have a great discussion.